I'm going to be introducing our speaker shortly, but first I'd like to say a few other things. First, for those who aren't familiar, I'd like to introduce this seminar series, Data Then and Now. So this is a series that explores the social and organizational history of data and data practices in order to better understand the current data-intensive moment through its antecedents and continuities. So this is our second talk for this year. We have two more coming up, both this month. You can see Louisa Moore and Tahu Kuktai. So Data Then and Now is co-hosted by eScience Institute, Human-Centered Design and Engineering, Information School, Science and Technology Studies Program, and the Simpson Center for the Humanities, all here at University of Washington. And although we're gathered virtually today, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Washington is located on the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. So today's speaker is Dr. Ramon Amaro. Thank you very much for being here. Dr. Amaro is lecturer in art and visual cultures of the Global South at University College London's History of Art Department. He has a forthcoming book, The Black Technical Object on Machine Learning and Aspiration of Black Being. Will be published by Sternberg and MIT Press this year. Is that right, I think? And this book is a contemplation on the abstruse nature of machine learning, mathematics, and the deep incursion of racial hierarchy. Dr. Amaro completed his PhD in philosophy at Goldsmiths while holding a master's degree in sociological research from the University of Essex and a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is also co-founder of the Queer Computing Consortium, investigates the role of language in computational systems, its impact on locally embedded community practices. Today, Dr. Amaro is going to deliver a talk titled Machine Learning, Sociogeny, and the Substance of Grace. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And please take it away, Ramon.
Okay, thank you very much, James, for the warm introduction. And I would also like to thank the rest of the team for coordinating my arrival there virtually as we know it, which is our new life at the moment. But I really do appreciate the invitation and also the opportunity to share my work with you all today. And I would like to make a note that, James, that I thought that your recognition of the location and placement of the university and the historicity of the peoples there was quite beautiful. So thank you for acknowledging that in this moment. So in the interest of time, I think I'll get started because I'm looking forward to the Q&A with you all. What I thought I would prepare for you today is a discussion that sort of underpins the theoretical framework of the book itself. And then I'm happy to talk more about the book, which will be released in September of this year. Happy to talk about more details about how the book has arrived and a bit deeper exploration of the chapters within, and especially its type of motivations. Ultimately, the book builds up to a notion in which I'm working through called the Black Technical Object. And hopefully the idea of what that means might become more clear by the end of this talk. So I wanted to just get right into it. Oh, and by the way, I'm a fan of contingency and interruption. So if there is anyone on the line that has an immediate question, I guess I can keep an eye on the chat as well. But if you feel the need to interrupt, please do so. And I'm happy to interact with you to whatever extent that I can. Okay, let's get started. Despite promises of a more responsible and equitable future, recent advances in machine learning research have, even unwittingly, widened the gap between objectivity and racial injustice. For some time, we have been seduced by notions of machine learning's usefulness in the general application of the algorithmic in our social milieu. Of course, by usefulness, I refer to the quality of assigning data a practical use value, or more so, putting data into service as a social utility, a practice that has been accelerated under the general terms of assigning quantifiable value to habitual human praxis. While in the 1950s until around the 1980s, the aims of what one might call algorithmic innovation was organized primarily around the act of play, as the great and later shamed father of AI, Marvin Minsky, proclaimed before his death. These aims, and even perhaps prescient from a Marxist point of view, quickly matured from an individual concern to development for the sake of corporate and administrative objectives, which have now infiltrated every aspect of social life, from leisure to government and administrative activity. This has all occurred while creating increasingly large gaps between individual participation for the sake of participation or praxis and the development of algorithms for the sake of social organization and control. Nonetheless, the usefulness of algorithms, despite their publicly tested applications, is inexplicably tied to a more expansive circulation of ideas that demonstrate our increased exhaustion with present circumstances, having extracted all perceived material and non-material value from the past. Exhausted with the present, we have instead turned towards the future to provide sufficient insight into the world around us, while holding the algorithmic as the vessel through which this body of knowledge is to be understood. Through its predictive capabilities made possible with our assistance, the algorithmic has in effect collapsed the future onto the present and past by producing insights that can effectively learn from history and validate in the present for the purposes of predicting the future. And let's not be coy here. This future time is an intoxicating opportunity for habitual extraction, newly formed hierarchies, and the recurrence of individual and collective races to power. To possess the algorithm is therefore to possess the future, whereby the spoils of the unknown can be predicted, collected, and organized under the familiar guise of technological objectivity. This collective consequences are obvious here. We have seen this before. However, it still remains an individual question, and I will address this idea of the individual later. And I just want to point out now that I'm not talking about the individual as individualism, but the individual in a different concept, which I'll discuss perhaps during the Q&A. But this is important because on the one hand, the individual, such as the engineer as we know it, seeks to position the algorithmic as a precise set of rules specifying how to solve social problems that we somehow imagine have left us behind, or that we can leave behind. Yet on the other, the so-called problem in itself, from which the algorithm's usefulness is defined, is dependent upon the initial reduction of historical difficulties we have encountered in attempts to resolve these same issues. It is within reason that the engineer might shudder at this claim, as there is a certain facticity to algorithmic design that makes explicit that there are and will always be contingency within any algorithmic process, which means something or someone will be left behind. And in many cases, this is the exact point: to reduce a possible event or occurrence, which we humans like to leave to chance, and instead put the algorithmic to work alongside humans for a particular purpose or use as designated. This is what we call optimization or efficiency, or a series of actions towards the skillful removal of waste, whether that waste be time, effort, an immigrant, benefits cheat, or a national enemy. Pick a time and a place, and the algorithmic can help collate and identify that which is seen as waste or entropy, and feed these knowledges back to humans as insights into a future removed of this designated problem. This is not to say that this type of knowledge building is without collective value. In our present moment, many of us are invested in a future free of deadly viruses and contaminants, free of cancers, poverties, and other inequitabilities. There are computational processes that help us imagine, with part hope and part belief certainty, that we may be rid of these phenomena. In this way, the development of algorithms as aids to the process of individual and collective well-being is not without its benefits. Yet they are also not mutually exclusive of any potential for individual and collective harm. They are, as the cliche goes, two sides of one coin, where we are increasingly unable to perform our own risk assessments as humans, as we are increasingly uncertain of any potential harm or disparity is worth the ascribed benefits of the algorithmic. Of course, I do look forward to this type of Q&A to see where we arrive on this spectrum, because I imagine that many of you reside at the borders of this polarity between algorithmic benefit and algorithmic deficit, or many of us, lie in between. But to return, and it's not this that I want to place primary focus on as yet. For now, I want to think about the individual and collective position within this type of knowledge structure, or more so the psychosocial impact of learning about the world and each other through algorithmic mediation. Given what I have just discussed, in terms of the individual and collective relation within the algorithmically mediated environment, I am concerned with the factors that might result in a more amplified form of alienation, whereby the cognitive relation between one's act of being in the present is continually distanced from their self-imagined future, and is instead overly determined by an external source of knowledge production and often violent acts to follow. I have argued throughout my work that this moment of psychic alienation is not unfamiliar. It has occurred in previous acts of social optimization, namely in what I speak upon as colonialism and chattel slavery, and therefore can provide particularly useful insights into the replication of the logics of these practices as we enter a more pervasively mediated algorithmic society. For instance, Frantz Fanon has written extensively on the psychological dependency imposed on the colonized as well as the colonizer in service of the logics of colonial expansion. Fanon argues that the psychosocial awareness of the impact of the systemic mode of organization and extraction produces what he terms a certain uncertainty in the individual psyche, whereby one is confronted by the gap between how one is perceived in the external and how one imagines themselves to be. Fanon identified that this phenomenon was also atemporal, as the external perception of the racialized in particular, in terms of stereotype, did not require one to act in the present necessarily. They can merely be present and thereby be associated with past and future cultural stereotype. This move is crucial when we consider the radical type of human Fanon proposes, which first and foremost, as argued by Fanon, begins with an already internal capacity to resist forms of representation. Fanon's engagement suggests an individual as well as a collective responsibility to travel through the dynamic creation of subjectivity to reimagine new representations and ways of living to escape this phenomenon. If I dare to bring the psychic phenomenon of colonialism together with the psychic phenomenon of computation, then the convergence between the algorithmic and the Black psyche can then be understood as a relation of pre-established categorization by which practices of power, as well as Black psychic generation, might be examined more closely. I argue that this process, although not void of historical influence, is not only a necessary element of freedom, but a politics in itself, particularly as the algorithmic becomes an increasingly important factor in the production of who and what we are. While Fanon did not speak of the algorithmic specifically, he does have comments on technology very briefly, especially in the pinnacle work of Black Skin, White Mass. But in this terms, as I'm using it here, he doesn't speak on machine learning and algorithms specifically. He didn't live long enough to encounter these phenomenons. But he does introduce us to the concept of sociogeny, or I like to actually call it sociogeny. Yeah, it's wrong, but I stick with it. So I'm going to use that one because I like it, which helps us understand the epistemic imposition of social order. While sociology places colonialism in line with the ontological refusal to account for Black existence, as Fanon argues, this refusal is also self-justificatory. It validates its own existence by reducing Black experience to categories of lower species. Here, the Black man is seen as an object or a non-being. The ontological refusal reinstates its position of power with the help of science, including the field of psychiatry, and as we know now, data science and so forth, even unwittingly. The sciences aid in installing empirical methods for the purposes of validation and control. The aim was to empirically validate racial hierarchy as divine provenance. Once fully materialized, Fanon argues that empiricism opened a pathway to capital exploitation, which was enacted primarily through technical objects, infrastructures, and regulatory measures. It is here that I argue that a current technical object, such as machine learning, might reveal similar modes of exploitative operations, as well as opportunities for resistance. I want to take Fanon's exploration of the Black psyche as a point of departure to establish a consistency between the sociogenic process and the arresting of affirmative Black psychic genesis. As I will argue, it is necessary to return to sociogeny in both its pathological and empirical relations, if any attempt at disrupting the durability of racial sorting and the negation of Black being in technical racial ecologies is to come to life. By techno-racial, I mean the materialization and most often the production of discriminations, prejudices, and reductions of life chances that emerge at the intersections of race and technologies that aid in the perception of Blacks in the environment from a specific, quantifiable point of view. The technosocial is key to what I present are the conditions that exist prior to any present engagements with data and machine learning models. Ultimately, I seek these claims in order to discuss a mode of existence that considers both the imagined certainty of the algorithmic alongside and in between the uncertainty of one's own sensory experience with life as mediated by the technological. More so, I want to organize my thoughts around the collision of one's sensory experience as mediated by the perception of algorithmic bias, specifically in terms of what Sylvia Wynter calls the substance of race. The substance, summarizing Wynter, is the grasping of being as that which already unifies racial perception with the staging of white, European, and imperial power over the stranger. The substance of race constitutes an ordering of the world through the image of white supremacy as the precondition for the structuring of society. Here, the characteristics of whiteness, what we might call the ideal state or the good form. Here, Wynter picks up on, an Aristotle and the good form, and then going, of course, previous that to Plato. We don't have time to get into that, but I'm happy to do it during the Q&A. But this idea of the good form of whiteness, and particularly in this sense, I think we can do it in terms of today to say even the white heterosexual, Anglo-European male as ascending to the apex of human value in replacement of this good form. And, as Wynter takes us through in her canon of work and how this actually becomes a type of prototypical replacement for the divine itself. But here I want to think to how this might mirror our collective adoption to feel that prototypical role, or as Lewis Gordon describes whiteness, with a new mode of oversight. What I argue here might be mirrored in the algorithmic. It is difficult these days not to enter into close proximity with the substances of race during our everyday encounters with the algorithmic. This is despite one's ethnic or national identity, as the racialized information continues to circulate throughout algorithmic application, whether one subscribes to and celebrates those ideas or shudders at their presence, which leaves us with the possible impossibility of diverting ourselves from the recurrent cycle of racial division that circulates as information irrespective of one's desire to engage. This means that the algorithmic has, even unwittingly in practice, attained a utility that is ubiquitous and porous, in that its usefulness is not limited to mere corporate or administrative gain as first thought, but can produce both reward and deficit for individuals depending on their subscribed beliefs and ideals. The true usefulness of the algorithmic is like that of a food source like tofu. It provides a precise need, whether it be operational or psychosocial, if the two can be separated. In this need is encaptured for whomever chooses to incorporate its findings into their perceptions of the world. In other words, like tofu, its most useful quality is that it can provide substance while taking on the dominant flavor of whatever it surrounds. The layering of this aspect of awareness, while it might not in all cases enter into consciousness, exists as a precondition for one's perceptual view of algorithmic utility. In other words, the algorithmic does not simply illuminate our social impositions like race, racism, and racial categorization. It more acutely stimulates already existent racial dynamics by offering comfort, support, resistance, or rejection, or even duress of an already sensorial mode of experience. I do not mean to suggest, as the puppets in the old Broadway play Avenue Q have, that, everyone's a little bit racist. I don't know if anyone remembers that song. But what I do want to suggest is that our process of knowing, as mediated by algorithmic information transfer, is equally conditioned by an opportunity to receive any artificially induced sensory information through what is called the transtemporality. Though the operation of the mind can operate both within and outside the immediacy of the senses. In this term, I'm talking about the psychosocial impact and proximity between one and racial stereotypes and dynamics. And what this means, and what I suggest, is that when it comes to issues of race in the algorithmic, what might appear to be a conscious unfolding of racial dynamics that depend on one's recognition of and proximity to racialized information is, to the contrary, an opportunity to remove the perception of race away from the algorithmic investigation of human cognitive behavior towards a process of self-knowing, a knowing that is already in immediate recognition of the paradox between one's externally imposed racial position and an internal reality that eclipses any predeterminacy. Put simply, within artificial sensory replication, as set forth in the algorithm's ability to stimulate and simulate effectual awareness, is an equivalent human potential to re-articulate the phenomenon of race. If we allow for the adoption of alternative precognitive views of the world, whereby algorithmic utility can be redefined as that which does not usurp human decision-making, but that which instead places demands on human existence to see and or recognize our own fallibilities for the explicit purposes of doing, rescripting, and becoming a collective body that is always already in conversation with proven disparities of human division, yet remains actively aware of the alienating delusions of these expectations. This is ultimately an effort to move our social anxiety and impositions away from the perceived divide between our experiences as defined by our realities and artificial realities as simulated by the algorithmic as such, and open them up to the precognitive or future second sight, whereby we as humans already possess a foreknowledge of a future that contains our historical and present racial dynamics, providing an opportunity to reduce our dependence on the algorithm as the site of racial debate in favor of a critical reflection on ourselves and the act of grounding our human futures within the parapsychological mode of existence that seeks to think beyond what has been normalized as explanation for phenotypical or cultural difference into a people that gain freedom through the power to decide what constitutes the problem of the real. And that's sort of, I'll conclude this sort of very theoretically dense introduction. And so to end, I just wanted to sort of give you the sort of insight. This isn't an excerpt from the book, but it does give insight into what I'm trying to arrive at in the book. And I'm trying to think through not just how racial perception is unfolded through the algorithmic, but I'm more interested in trying to place the circulation of this type of substance of race and how it actually enters into the algorithmic structure, then gets replicated in direct connection with the human senses. And for me, it becomes far more complicated than just thinking about, contaminated or biased data and how it's processed through the algorithmic structure and then this categorization and output. And what I'm trying to arrive to is the precondition of the affect of the output even prior to the bias of the data. So I'm actually in the prior to prior. And so in the book, what I sort of begin with is this sort of exegesis, as I've done in the paper, of how the substance of race circulates, its psychosocial impacts. So the beginning of the book relies heavily on Fanon and Winter to think about this type of certain uncertainty and this revision of a Marxist type of alienation that enacts itself within the social process. Then I sort of turn to Winter in the next chapter to then think about how this becomes an epistemic form of knowledge, which becomes self-justificatory and of course births technologies and infrastructure and so on and so forth. And then what I do is I sort of enter into a new part where I return to the history of data and statistics, because, you know, we probably, many of us know on this line, but, you know, machine learning and AI aren't new technologies. Of course, they were formalized in the 1950s. About the 1980s, machine learning and AI split into two so-called disciplines for different symbolic aims. But they actually emerged from a history of statistics. And it's very difficult to actually distinguish between statistical structures and machine learning structures, because they actually use both methods, and AI does as well. And so what I do is I trace the history of data and statistics back to the 17th century, and beginning with Prussia and Leibniz. And I start looking at the idea of how data emerged as the epistemic tool in which one is to imagine a social organization. And then I take that moment to build up to the complication with machine learning. And it's important for me in machine learning to not just state it as such. You know, I believe when we're talking about these types of debates and the seriousness of these types of debates, it can't be taken for granted how the flow of this epistemic knowledge happens. So what I do in this chapter is, the chapter is basically a tutorial of machine learning. I do a step-by-step of what are we actually talking about? How does data circulate? How does it get trained? Where does it go? What are the symbolic functions? How it gets processed, how it gets output, where its historicity is. And then I turn again to think more philosophically about this interplay between the individual and the collective. And then ultimately I end with the Black technical object, and thinking about, then if we are to develop a new perceptual framework of race, how does this Black object actually then traverse through this history, specifically traverse through the algorithmic structure to arrive at a space of non-representation as phenomenon imposed. So I'll leave it there.
Excuse me, Ramon, we have a raised hand here.
Mm-hmm.
Javier?
Yes.
Would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you very much for your intervention. So I was thinking in what you said about the part of the algorithm and the outputs. So do you think that the problem is not itself the algorithm, but just the categorization of the outputs in the sense? So I mean, the input data and the output have a very strong relationship between. So in this case, the racist problem, do you think it's more the categorization of how the data is going to be processed by the algorithm, or it's just the process of the mathematical internal part of the algorithm?
Yeah. In a way, it's a simple yet complicated question for that. So thank you, Javier, for bringing that up, because I think it's implicitly important. Really what the response to is thinking about the immediacy and the duress that comes with the algorithm's artificial reproduction of the human condition, which is already racial categorization. So what I try to show in the book is that this practice of using the technological tool as the manifestation of an already existing cultural process that is dependent and almost desires social categorization is nothing new. So that's why I trace it back to the history of and philosophy of mathematics and statistics. So basically, we've been doing this for hundreds of years. The difference now is we have this very advanced, more pervasive technology that can almost real time replicate and sort of feed back that information to us. And the reason why I start to talk with the definition of the problem is, and that's why I sort of very cheekily describe the algorithmic as a type of tofu, is depending on who's establishing the problem will depend on how the machinic perceives this social environment. So in other words, this is why we see those echo chambers of white supremacy, and you see circulations of racial dynamics, because it's actually just mediating an existing cultural relation and milieu that has already been circulated. It's just advanced at picking up the particulars of these and then placing them in a collective and spitting them out. Now, it's worth speaking here that despite our tendency to speak of the algorithmic as a type of sentience, right? It's not sentient. An algorithm is no more than an array of step-by-step functions of symbolic mathematical proofs. And because it's those proofs, and this is what I do in the book, this is why I go into machine learning, because I start at the philosophy of the proof itself, like something like the differential with Leibniz. Let me sort of step back. How we approach contemporary computer science is as if these symbolic tools are natural phenomena like gravity, right? I have a symbolic function like the differential equation. I go to school. I know it's been an engineering school. I go to school. I learn this function. I have no question about where that function comes from. All I know is its purpose and its utility. But if we look at these particular types of functions, they have a particular historicity. So for instance, a differential, which powers all neural networks, all advanced machine learning have differential equations. And the reason they have differential equations is they were developed to subsume motion. So basically Leibniz was in conversation with Newton. They had a linear, actually they were doing it at the same time. There's a debate who did it first. But prior to that, we only had linear algebra, which of course was proficient at going from linear from point A to point B. Leibniz and Newton began to develop a system whereby what they realize is that socially, materially, and not, we're very dynamic. The world is very dynamic and cannot account for a linear type of trajectory. We can think of like the weather. So what they begin to develop is how do we account for the dynamism, this is where we get the curve from, in a new type of algebra. And this is where a different type of calculus emerges. So now they can pick a point in space and time, and they can reduce all of the conditions and dynamics around that into a singular type of point. Now, what's very interesting about this historicity is Leibniz wanted to practice this by developing a 10-point plan to colonize Egypt. Wow. It was never separated in the first place. It was always a part of the same mission and same goal. Somewhere along the centuries, we've forgotten this, and now we just use that. So what I'm suggesting is not that the differential or the algorithm is racist. What I'm suggesting is it's already conditioned within the ability to symbolically represent categorization. So to then see the output of machine learning replicating it, we shouldn't be surprised. And my concern is that we're so surprised by the output that we should actually expect, that we actually are usurping our own abilities to revise the human condition, which would solve the purpose, which would solve the output to begin with. Sorry, it's a very long answer to get around.
But
so it's not as simple as saying it's the problem of the algorithm. That's why it's actually a human technical problem that will never be solved until we stop positioning the algorithm as some sort of alien abstract bucket of our human condition. Because regardless of what the algorithm does, because it can only replicate and simulate that which it understands from our behavior. And even that behavior is abstracted into different points. It's categorized, it's patterned. And even those patternings, see, the algorithm doesn't understand what a cat is. An algorithm doesn't understand that people like cats. What the algorithm understands is that data point plus data point plus data point plus data point equals cat. Data point, happiness, a smile. Data point, data point, data point means human with a smile. Every time human with a smile talks about cats, must mean humans like cats. I mean, that's how it thinks. It doesn't come out of the bat and say already existing modes of meaning and stereotypes. So in other words, if in our social condition, we have already become comfortable with categorizing different peoples as being lesser than other peoples, then it doesn't matter if it's machine learning, AI, or the next technology, it will continue to make that association because we ourselves we don't want to get rid of it. We're dependent on it. So sorry, that was a very long answer to.
It was a very good answer because sometimes we tend to think that just changing the data and making some changes might remove the bias, but it seems like the problem is the categorization of the mathematical process.
Well, yeah, exactly. And the problem is also for human beings that have done nothing but be human beings, we sure know little about being a human being. I mean, we spend a lot of time with absolutely very little understanding of ourselves and how we relate to the world. And we like to simplify that into these type of Cartesian categories of good or bad, left or right, Democrat, Republican. We do all this stuff to try to categorize as an understanding and justification for the behaviors that have already been conditioned within our being. And what I'm suggesting is an equal side of that conditioning is an equal side of an epistemic liberation. And this is where I pick up on Fred Moten here, that actually, because machine learning can do the same thing. It actually, if you put it for the purposes of solving child poverty, it will come up with solutions. But if you put it to the purposes of increasing child poverty, it will come up with solutions. And it provides a pathway for us, even optimistically, to think about how we can reconfigure our own human relationships.
So thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Ramon, do you have more to say in your talk, or do you want to go into questions?
No, I would love to go into questions if that's okay.
I wasn't quite sure. I wasn't sure if that was okay.
They're kind of one and the same. So
all right. So for a bit free form, that's great. I guess I can start it off. Anyone, please enter your questions in the chat or wherever, and I can read them to Ramon, or you can have your mic on and you can speak them out, I guess, however you would like. So I have one kind of specific one and one more general question for you. And the specific one is, since you use the term technical object, are you drawing on the philosopher Simondon? And if so, I'd like to hear a little bit about your connection. I've been reading Simondon lately. I'd like to hear exactly what you find interesting about his very idiosyncratic understanding of technology.
Yep.
And second, more generally, I think we often have a historical perspective in this lecture series. So I think everyone here would love to hear if any more little episodes like you had, if you have, like that Leibniz one in the history of sort of data and alienation, like the deep history. I've never heard about that little Leibniz episode you mentioned there. I was quite surprised. That's all.
Thanks. They're great questions. I'll try to answer them quickly so we can get to other questions. So thank you for that. You're absolutely right, because this is where I'm going in the book is I draw heavily on Simondon, and that's why I sort of preface this idea of the individual. So basically, what I'm staging at this point, will probably be in the second book. But what I'm staging at this point is I suspend the assumption that Black being is already an object from Fanon. And then I take Fanon's sort of political moment and ontological moment then to reconsider it within his adoption of French structuralism. So basically, we know this, Fanon, Simone Brown has talked about this in the past extensively, that Fanon was, he was a peer of Foucault and Simondon and Guattari and so on and so forth. We don't consider them to be actually in the same conversation. And if you look at it, so Simone Brown does really well. If you look at actually biopolitics with Foucault and you read Black Skin, White Mask, it's almost like they're the same book. And it's unclear where, because we know Foucault went to Fanon's lectures in Tunis, it's unclear who influenced each other. I don't think it matters because that's how knowledge circulates, right? So what I want to do is I want to put Fanon in direct conversation with Simondon. And with Simondon, so what I want to do, and then I want to take Fanon, because the problem with Fanon is, of course, he gets trapped in the psychosocial neuroses where he's seeing this implicit, he wants to bring the Black object together with the world object, with the species of human, but at the same time, he cannot divorce himself from the racial stereotype of the Black object, which means he has already individuated, this is what I argue in the book, he's already individuated the Black being and then is looking at an escape. But at the same time, he wants to escape it because what he's suggesting is This is what Kerr Keeling does really well. What he's suggesting is that both the form of the Black being must be annihilated, the form of the what so-called white being must be annihilated in order for a new species to emerge. With Simondon, however, race becomes the amplification of the senses to a pre-existing pre-individual milieu. So we know that for Simondon, this process of individuation, and anything that resembles a form is just an amplification of existing and present conditions that have formed that being. I like to think of it, like I describe it to my students as a type of like a wave in the ocean, right? The wave comes up, articulates itself into a form temporarily, and then it falls back in the milieu of life. And then another comes up, which means it's impossible to separate. And for Simondon, the anxiety was in our fallibility. Basically, Simondon is saying we made a mistake by separating ourselves from technology when we are one and the same. And I'm arguing that Fanon made a mistake by separating the colonial mission from us. He thinks it's together, but he's only specifically talking about the white object. He spent too much time with Hegel, basically. So what I'm suggesting is if it's already preconditioned, then what might happen? And what Simondon allows me to do is take it out of that representation of Blackness, put it in a different cultural milieu, and then see how it circulates as a different type of object, because that object doesn't have to be a negating object like Fanon. And this is where I go in the book, is actually what if, I try to pick up that question from Fred Moten, what if there's nothing wrong with the Black object? What then can machine learning do? So that's kind of that point. It's far more complex to unpack. The second question the second question about a type of historical antidote, which I find very interesting, is actually why Leibniz is one of my favorite philosophers, because he was bat crazy. I mean, the gall, the audacity of this guy to come up with these proofs. So basically, one of my favorite moments is, so Leibniz basically traveled around Europe trying to sell his data models and his mathematical models. See, we don't think about that actually today, that a lot of these people like Laplace and Quetelet and all these people, they came up with these concepts, but then they had to sell these concepts because they were not legitimate. See, we automatically legitimize them today, which I think is why our debates and data bias are wild, because we just assume they exist. Like if we literally stopped taking them seriously, they would not be serious because they derive from a person's ideas and they just happen to work. It's not like they're divinely sanctioned, right? And so when Leibniz goes, he develops these sort of equations. He starts to get infused with, he circulated in the aristocracy of early Western Europe. He starts to get familiar with the Prussian monarchy. At this point, it's an empire, so the emperor and empress. And he has this idea, because of course, at this point in the 17th century, early 18th century, Prussia was just a collection of villages. And Leibniz had this idea. He said, I have this thing called data. He didn't invent it. It was already invented in the global South. But he said, I want to take data, which means I can count your resources and your population, right? Ian Hacking does a great illustration of this type of history, right? And what he does is he convinces them to begin to collect data. So all of a sudden, the Prussian Empire begins to collect data on its populations. The easiest way to do that was to turn to the local parishes. If anyone's been to Europe, every town has a church in the center, right? It is the central node of knowledge. So parishes begin to take birth and death, but they begin to collect birth and death records. Then they begin to collect records on the disease. What did you die of? How many males, how many females, how many cattle, how many whatever. It's extraordinary. And in the book, what I show is if you look at these charts from these, they call them life tables. If you look at these charts, they look just like training data for machine learning. and basically what happened is it was the first time a Western European nation could actually centralize information about their territories. And then the dodgy stuff started to happen. Because what they realize is that the power of their army, of course, is heavily gendered. the power of their army depended upon how many males they had in their territory that they could call to war. Statistics, thanks to his champion Leibniz, gave them a way now to predict how many males will be born, because now we have data. If I have a village that births more males than females compared to another village, then that's where I need to focus. And then the Prussian Empire would send resources to that area. Basically, we need more males, we'll send them the food. And then it gets even more dodgy, because they have these records, they begin to centralize these records thanks to Leibniz. And that was the birthing of the first national number. It was the birth of the first census, the birth of the first national number. Everyone has one. I think you guys call it Social Security number. It is the centralized number. And when we think of Leibniz, we think about this universal language, right? He created a universal language through math. That's why you have a Social Security number. That number communicates your age, your birthday, your taxes, your whatever. And it allows the state to have one uniform way to now communicate with everyone. This is how he was able to try to sell how to actually manage colonial subjects and slaves. He tried to sell them to the slaver countries to manage local populations. France wouldn't buy it, so he sold it to the Dutch, by the way. But so, and then what gets really, really interesting is, if that's not interesting enough, because the Prussian Empire realized at this moment that they could count the number of men and resources and food, they realized that so could their enemies, because all you have to do is go in there and start counting. And so that was the first time that data actually became a proprietary source. So they had to protect this data, put it on lockdown. So basically it was the birth of the first black box. This data must be protected like a military intelligence, because it is military aim. So that's one sort of screwy antidote about. And it's one of the reasons why I don't want to simplify. There, in no way do I want to simplify the immediacy of the debate when we talk about algorithmic bias and discrimination, because I believe these two spaces are necessary, one in the immediacy, but also what I found in my research is there's another line of attack that needs to address the ontological structure of how we actually see the technical object. Because if we don't do both, then we're just basically we're responding to an output that has already been preconditioned. So basically, before you put your shoes on to the protest, you already know what's going to happen. You already know what your grandchildren are going to experience, because we haven't solved the recurrent cycle of these.
So would you place your work somewhere aligned with the sort of reaction to the first wave of critical data studies, I guess, or the AI ethics first wave of that? And now people are sort of responding to that. Oh, well, you know what? Perhaps I should stop monopolizing here. We have two other people in line. So forget my question. Megan has her hand raised here, so I will let her speak, and then we have a question from Charlie.
You know, I'll read Charlie's question, and then because mine kind of, I think, fits well with this one. So Charlie asks in the chat, what would be the kind of appropriate political activity that follows your analysis? From my understanding of Fanon, for example, he was quite clear that he saw his work of psychiatry as a kind of harm reduction, but doing away with colonial neurosis and racism at their root ultimately requires the political and material liberation of the people, the violence of decolonization. But you seem to be suggesting that there is some kind of epistemic or narrative correction or engineering correction that might transform social relations via either AI or our discourses about them, question mark?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Charlie. That's a great question. I'm gonna try to answer this quickly. I'm not good at quick answers. So yes, maybe, not really. Let me explain. So the thing with what Fanon is trying to do, of course, we know Fanon is leading the psychiatric hospital. He does an experiment where he has patients from both the colonial, basically he has French patients from mainland France, he has Algerian patients. He develops a program similar to Guattari to try to develop social harm. So you're right in that sense. What he noticed is in his experiments and his therapies is that the same therapy would work for the white Europeans. It would not work for the Algerians. That's where he begins to develop the idea of the psychosocial implications of colonialism. So his purpose is not harm reduction. His purpose is re-scripting the perception. That's why he turns to Hegel, Merleau-Ponty, Lacan, because he wants to reform the colonized I. It's not to reduce harm. He wants to change the perception of that individual that they are not the colonized, that they are not the deficit that has been imposed upon them. And in turn, at the same time, he realizes, obviously, along this journey that regardless, this is what he learns from Hegel, is that regardless of their own, the colonized, this is called the sort of Black individual, even if the Black individual were able to violently disrupt their own perceptual framework to emerge as something more affirmative, you still have this white structure that's equally dependent upon categorizing the Black individual as lesser than. So then he begins to formulate that it's actually necessary for, this is where you can hear the tinges of Hegel, the dialectic here. He begins to formulate that actually the white man's perception also needs to be upheaved and removed. They both need to happen at the same time. And this is his radical human. Now, as we move into Wretched of the Earth, of course, there's been a lot of discourse on violence. I'm going to put myself out there because this will actually be in work that I'm working on right now in the book. Is basically what I argue in the book is that Fanon is talking out of both sides of his mouth because he does this a lot. If you really read him carefully, I'm not suggesting you haven't, many have, but read him again. He's always talking explicitly and psychosocially at the same time. He's talking in reality and also a hyperstition of reality. So I'm arguing that, yes, he's talking about the necessity of violence to disrupt colonialism, but he's also talking about the necessity of the psychosocial violence in which it takes one to reformulate and reposition their own perception. Basically, it's a violent process. It's not just the physical violence of a gun. It's a different type of violence as well. And what that require is that violent upheaval of the self to arrive at something new would already be in conversation with the political and material liberation of the people, because Fanon already established that at the beginning of the book. You can't separate the two. That's what sociogeny is. Exactly what you're saying. It's the inability to separate those two. And this goes to James' question about Simondon. So that's why I want to pick that back up, because Fanon only spends one short paragraph in his intervention with Freud, even talking about that concept. And I want to take that out. Now, what this means here is I'm not suggesting a type of technological solutionism. I'm also not suggesting a type of social solutionism. I'm taking a first step of the debate and I'm thinking about the question prior to solution, which is, what Denise Ferrar da Silva might call this kind of first act of value and thought, which arrives prior to the decision of the framework. And I believe that's why I tap into Fanon's psychosocial process. He's talking about the psychosocial act of decision prior to. And if I look at that act of decision prior to, what I'm suggesting is if we're able to change our perception about the relationship between ourselves, our environment, ourselves, and technology, what might emerge is a new way to look at the algorithmic in order to produce political and material liberation. And the last thing I'll say is one way that I argue in the book, and I've argued throughout my work, that this is possible is especially with advanced neural networks. I'm writing a lot now on GANs and things like that. In an advanced neural network, of course, we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of hidden layers. And these layers, of course, communicate with each other. They have roots in simulating a neural process and how the neurons fire energy between each other. That's how it kind of began with this new structure. It's not so much focused on that anymore, but that's how the structure of the algorithm actually looks. And what it does is each node is communicating with each other, and they're stacked in layers. So there's a single input or many inputs, and they stack up like layers. What is not well known is that beyond the third or fourth layer, the computation is at such a high level that it's incomprehensible to humans. It's incomprehensible. Basically, we know the neural network works because the expected output matches the input. We don't know that it works because we followed it through all of the 1,000 layers. That's a misnomer. So what actually is happening is there's an existing computation. What I'm arguing is philosophically is that there's an existing computational structure that is only communicating with itself. And it's the first time that there's a perceptual framework on this planet that lives outside of our biased framework. Which means that this is why I trace the black technical object through it in the book, because ultimately what I want to do is I want the black technical object to communicate with that area, because it's impossible to find liberation with the structure that we've created in the world today. And Fanon had already set this forth. We may desire it, but it's impossible. And so what I'm looking at is how the impossible is already articulating itself. And then I want to tap into that to then start experimenting. And it may be a failed project, I don't know. But the one thing I do depend upon, this last thing I'll say so we can move on, the one thing I depend upon, and I really want us to think about, something like Kara Keeling's latest book, I think is it Queer Times, Black Futures? Correct me if I'm wrong. The introduction, the preface is that it's brilliant. And she's stating very explicitly that we were never meant to survive. And what she means is, and she's picking up on Fanon as well. And that's what Fanon's saying. We were never meant to survive, not representationally. What we mean is we are beings in a world that perceptually changes. Each iteration of us is meant to be annihilated in order for a new us to emerge. And I'm talking about individually and collectively. I am not supposed to be the person I was 10 minutes ago or 2 days ago or 2 years ago. I'm supposed to be a different iteration that has been conditioned by new experiences and sensations to emerge as a new type of being. This is why I pick up on Simondon, right? I'm supposed to be a new wave, not a replication of existing waves. And somehow we found ourselves sociopolitically and economically in a culture, in a milieu in 2021, where most people in the world want everything to be the same. No one wants to change. And if they do want to change, they want to go back to version 1.0, because somehow version 1.0 was better. And we have foreclosed the future in order to emerge there. And this is what Keeling's basically saying. We were never meant to go back or stay static. We were meant to always break that perceptual framework in order for us to enter into a new self. So that's kind of another complicated answer.
Thanks for that. I think we have time probably for one more. Do we have one more question out there?
Someone's saying, hi, hello.
I would love to hear more. So you put kind of a teaser up in your talk about how you were using individual. And I feel like that's been floating in the background of a couple of these interesting responses. And which, by the way, don't feel long at all. They're just, it's very helpful and interesting. So no need to apologize for them. But so I'd love to hear more about how you're thinking about individual and what you're meaning for that.
This is where Simondon comes to play right now, because what Simondon is saying is one of the mistakes we also made is thinking that we were already fully formed individuals. This is a product of Aristotle in the good form, building up into philosophy, of course, into Kant, and then further into Hegel, so on and so forth, was this installation, both ontologically as well as epistemically, that we were already fully formed beings. And what that means psychosocially for Fanon is, that's what he draws upon Lacan. He's basically saying that we think we are the I. We're just these fully formed beings that morph and experience the world. Where Simondon is saying, this is actually why Deleuze picks up on Simondon to think about the virtual. This is where he gets it from. And people debate about how much he gets from this. But basically what Simone is saying is that we are always living within a pre-individual state. And that pre-individual state is a collage, is a complicated web of all past, all future, our own futures, family's futures, the world's futures, our territory's futures, our ethnic futures, languages, all are tied into this precondition. And what happens is several modes of those intersections collide and they amplify to form who we are. So when you look in the mirror, it's an amplification of this wave of preconditions that have just amplified you for that moment. But that moment is past as soon as you recognize it. It literally is past. You're not the same person. You've lost hair, your hair's grown, you've lost skin cells, your lungs have deteriorated. Like you literally aren't the same person. So what he's saying is that that's why I compare it to the waves of the ocean. So for Simone Dunn, he's not concerned with the individual. He's concerned with the process of being individuated as an individual. And in this sense, then, so when I use the term individual, I usually don't go this far into it because it takes too much time. So when I use the individual, I'm already building the assumption that the individual is already the amplification of the individual and community. So you don't have to ask the question of how they're connected because they already are. and then by the time they get amplified, it's just recognizable in that moment. And how I connect this to machine learning is actually, this is what I argue is how machine learning sees the world. Machine learning doesn't, people hate when I say this, and I hate saying it, but algorithms don't care about us. They don't care that I like cats or that I like cereal or that I get on the train. It doesn't care, it's math. What it can do, if it were to care, what it cares about is the correlations and associations of my behavioral and identified modes. So basically what it's doing is it's picking up pre-individual points of my behavior that have already passed. It's putting them together, and that's the data double. And so what I'm suggesting in the debates about data politics is, why are you focusing on the data double? It's a fiction. The company knows it's a fiction. Marketing knows it's a fiction. We're the only ones that think it's us, right? Marketing is hoping we think it's us. That's why they want us to buy the cereal. But if we already recognize that it's just a replication of what it thinks our individuated state might be, this is where Fanon comes into play. See, for him, for how the Black man sees himself, he sees the data double, not himself. That's why the data double has to be erased, violently taken down. And for me, what it gives, and for Fanon, it's empowering. And so for Simone Dunn as well, it's empowering because once one recognizes that what one perceived in the world is not a solidity in the world, it gives one power to choose new forms of representation. And I think someone like, the trans and non-binary community do this very well. I have many non-binary friends and they're like, yeah, I dress like a boy because I felt like it for the day. Oh, I do this. I wanted to wear a skirt. Oh, I wanted to grow a mustache. Like, they know the illusion exists and they play with the specificities of illusion to tap into their sensory mode of being. That's something more affirmative. And then usually what becomes represented is a closer representation to their authentic self. What makes it dangerous is the sensation of that disparity and when it hits the environment. It's the environment that's reacting and reflecting back the disparity and the perception, whereas sometimes the person of difference has already moved on from that perception. That's why they find freedom in it.
Yeah. That was a really great linking up of individuation and machine learning. That was very helpful for me as well. And I think probably a great way to wrap up. And now everyone who's here knows about Simone Dunn. you know, welcome to the Simone. So thank you so much, Ramon, for this excellent talk.
Thank you all for having me.
All right, well, please, everyone, please thank Ramon, and there's no applause function anymore that Zoom, so you have to insert your applause visually.
Yeah. All right, thank you all.
Thank you,
Ramon. All right, it's great seeing you. Okay, bye-bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Take care.